Did you know that 33 million teen vapers globally think that because e-cigarettes don't cause cancer, like conventional cigarettes, they must be all good? By conveying the hazards of nicotine vaping as 5-minute short stories or microlearning, and spoken in the simplest language possible, Safeguard is by youth, for youth, and in the language of youth. Teen Vaping Awareness Mission. So, what are you waiting for? Listen, learn, quit.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Teen Vaping Awareness Microlearning platform Safeguard, where we seek to take the complex science of adolescent vaping and simplify it down for a teen-appropriate audience. So we've come a very long way over the course of our 5 stories as part of Safeguard, starting all the way back in story 1 when we discussed the history of the smoking and the invention of the e-cigarette, into story 2 when we contrasted smoking and vaping, into that organ-by-organ analysis of teen e-cigarette usage from story 3, the corporate tactics to lure minors to e-cigarettes in story 4, and most recently in story 5, the epidemiology of teen vaping, the US and global prevalence and trend analysis that we did in the last video. And now we're here to expand this epidemiology through the U of Safeguard, which has to do with understanding the triggers and determinants of teen vaping, these social determinants of health. And we're going to understand how these social triggering events, also known as social determinants, actually drive teens to vape, and actually how some of these social determinants of teen vaping can be reversed. So, to understand the meaning of epidemiology in a little bit more depth than we did last time in story 5, epidemiology is the study of how often a disease or disorder occurs in a certain group of people. That's what we focused on last time, the incidence, the prevalence, etc. And now we're here to go a little deeper and try to figure out why some of these people are at risk. What are the factors, not just the medical factors, but also these non-medical factors, whether they be genetic, environmental, social, that actually trigger a disease or disorder, or in this case, that trigger teens to vape. And here are a list of 6 of these determinants. These are 6 of the most salient drivers of teens to actually use e-cigarettes. And today's goal is going to be to delve deeply into each and every one of them and what some of their correlations with teen vaping mean for us. So starting off with race and culture as our first social determinant of health that we'll be focused on today. So vaping is an expensive habit. It costs around $50 to $100 a month. And that's why from 2011, when the National Youth Tobacco Survey, which we focused on in story 5, introduced vaping questions, the prevalence of e-cigarette usage has always been greater in white teens. However, the paradoxical observation is that since the National Youth Tobacco Survey in 2011, American Indian or Alaska Native, referred to as AIAN, populations have always had higher vaping rates. And this would initially sound surprising. These populations are often in isolation. They're often they're one of the most, if not the most, socioeconomically impoverished sort of race or ethnic group in the United States. So this observation that this group has super high vaping rates and would be able to even purchase something that costs $50 to $100 a month would be shocking initially. However, if we dig a little bit more deeply, we can understand that this might be attributable to this very isolation from mainstream America and this sort of social unconnectedness that these AIAN populations might have that might drive them to vape. And another new development is that in the 2024 National Youth Tobacco Survey, for the very first time, teen vaping rates have actually been similar, around 6%, in white, black, and Hispanic students, as you can see here. And the positive of this is that it demonstrates the success of culturally inclusive awareness campaigns like The Real Cost. And the negative is that these vape brands have started to offer major discounts to try to expand their clientele across socioeconomic groups, trying to lure teens, regardless of what their income status might be, to vaping. So now we're going to delve more deeply into mental health. So if you remember story 3 from a while back, we discussed how the purified nicotine in e-cigarettes bind to its matched nicotinic receptor and affect this release of happy neurotransmitters like dopamine. So now trying to connect mental health to vaping relatedly, What happens if we try to quantify this correlation? What we see is that depressed teens who need this sort of happy release of a neurotransmitter like dopamine actually end up turning to these e-cigarettes. And hence, high schoolers at a greater risk for vaping include those with very poor grades like D's and F's, those who struggle with sexual and gender orientation, and those with self-reported mental health issues as well, because these populations in their sort of mental state of being depressed desperately need these neurotransmitters, or at least think they do, in order to sort of provide this sort of boost of happiness to them externally. So now we're going to move into a discussion of socioeconomic status and how socioeconomic status, aka wealth or income, affect teen vaping. So this one is pretty complicated compared to some of the other social determinants, and we'll get to see why in a second. So social economic status has to do with family income, and obviously hence influences a lot of the life we lead and the exposures we have. And here you can see this correlation between wealth and e-cigarette usage, in the sense that the more wealthy you are, the more likely you are to use an e-cigarette. However, you can see here that one of the variables that affects this is actually one's advertising exposure. That the more wealthy you are, the more likely you are to have lots of targeted advertising coming to you, and hence the more likely you are to end up using an e-cigarette. And this advertising exposure is hence called the mediating variable in this sort of equation here. So socioeconomic status and e-cigarette usage are interrelated, and one increases and the other hence increases. Someone who's wealthy will be more likely to use an e-cigarette. That's the main takeaway from this. And this diagram here you can see is coming out of Connecticut, out of a study conducted by Yale University, but a myriad of other studies have come to a very similar conclusion. However, moving into discussing the effect of neighborhood on adolescent vaping, it's as if everything I said can just be refuted. So here we focus on neighborhood, or some people might call it neighborhood in one's built environment, which is sort of where we live, which is obviously super important in trying to understand our exposure and our predisposition to many health conditions, and in this case to vaping. So here you can see how in many cases having a situation where you're in a homeless shelter, in a transitional home, or in foster care can drastically increase your odds of vaping. And you understanding house permanency as a measure of sort of socioeconomic status, this would to an extent contradict what we discussed in the last slide, as people from these groups here are often in lower income communities. So the fact that these groups actually have a 60% or a 45% increase in vaping compared to groups or individuals at homes with both parents would be surprising. But the moral of this story is that the nuance is very important, that we need to be able to understand someone from a multifactorial lens, sort of understanding all of these social determinants at once, and then there's no cut and dried way that we can sort of use one of these determinants to tell us the whole story of a person and of them and their sort of vaping exposure or vaping likelihood. It's really important to have this sort of holistic, multi-factor approach in order to truly understand one's vaping status. So this is one example. Another thing we can see here is this diagram on the right, and this has to do with the vape shops by the affluency of a neighborhood in 2018. And you can see here that the more wealthy a neighborhood is, the less vape shops they have, the less exposure people have to actually vape, which sort of supports this graph to the left as well. So, but the main message here is just be considerate of the nuances in these things, because we got to have a multifactorial approach to really understand teen vaping. No one determinant is going to tell the full story. So now let's move into discussing friends and family. Our parents have always been telling us about a bad circle of family and friends, but no one's ever actually quantified this until now. And what you can see here is that if one has a friend who vapes, they have a 1.72 times or almost 2 times greater likelihood of vaping themselves. But wait, even when you think of something bigger than that, when you think of making a friend who vapes, that would lead to an increase in one's own likelihood to vape by 5 times. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is just how severe this is and how severe of an increase one can have in vaping by sort of hanging around with a circle of friends who also vape and sort of choosing friends who vape. And something that's equally surprising here is the way that family dynamics play a role in this, which surprised me quite a bit. That a family member using a vape or getting a vape from a family member, over 10% of current teen e-cigarette users in the National Youth Tobacco Survey in 2021 actually got a vape or got their first vape initially from a family member. It's crazy to think about how family members 10% of the time are the ones that are actually driving this cycle of addiction in teens. It's quite a jarring sort of reality to try to grasp here. So that's kind of what I wanted to leave you with about friends and family, and thus concludes our sort of discussion of the social determinants. But why do we study them? Where do we go from here? So by trusted adults, whether that be parents, teachers, coaches, etc., understanding that vaping may be a teen's reaction to their environment, and on having this sort of multi-factor approach of what that actually means, one can slowly ameliorate these surroundings to try to affect change and try to decrease teen vaping rates. So that's why we've gone into this deep analysis of the social determinants today. So now, as we always do, we're going to move into our learning objectives quiz. So here are the questions. Epidemiology is not just the study of how often a disease occurs, but also the study of what? Social determinants of health, what can they include? Why is it paradoxical that AIAN teens vape the most? What's true about teen mental health and vaping? Multiple answers. And what do we know about socioeconomic status in vaping? Multiple answers possible. So take a look through these questions, answer them carefully. I'll let you pause the video, and then we'll check back in on the answers. Okay, everyone, I hope you've been able to pause the video and attempt these questions. Here are the answers. So you can take a look at these here, the answer key for all 5 of the questions. And as usual, if you got 3 out of the 5 questions correct, thank you so much for tuning on with me, and let's move on to story 7.